At 5 in the morning, Harold Mitchell sat at his kitchen table with 3 papers that didn't belong together but were now the same problem. The first was the electric bill from Kansas Power and Light, $78.40 for the month. The second was a letter from First National Bank in El Dorado, signed by John Matt, telling him the payment on the farm loan was 3 months overdue, and that foreclosure proceedings would begin unless Harold could show a viable plan by Monday. The third was a Western Union telegram from his wheat buyer saying prices had dropped again, and after hauling costs his entire crop would bring $580. Harold didn't need more time to think. He needed less time to bleed. He had been working the same hours as always, cutting corners where he could, fixing what he could fix, and still the numbers were sliding backward. His monthly expenses were running $190. His income, averaged across wheat, cattle, and the egg money Margaret made, came to $140, $50 short every month. That shortage wasn't a theory. It was the reason the bank letter existed. It was the reason Harold's chest felt tight even while the house was quiet. He kept reading the electric bill as if a different total might appear if he stared long enough. He knew every item on the farm that drank power because he could hear them in his head. The well pump, the lights, the refrigerator, the motors in the shed that saved time but cost money every minute they ran. He'd been raised by a father who believed you didn't waste motion or money, but grid power had made wasting easy. Plug it in, forget it, pay for it later. Now later had arrived in the form of a banker with his hands tied. Margaret came in and stopped when she saw the papers spread out like a crime scene. She didn't ask how he slept because she could see it. "How bad?" she said, not as a question, more like a diagnosis. Harold cleared his throat once because his voice didn't want to work. "We've got until Monday," he said. "John Matt says if I can't show him real numbers, a real plan, he starts foreclosure. He says his hands are tied. Bank examiners are all over him about bad farm loans." Margaret sat across from him. She wasn't born into farms the way Harold was. She'd grown up in Augusta with sidewalks and stores that stayed open, then married him and learned fast that the farm didn't care what you believed. It only cared what you could do. She had learned to stretch a dollar until it screamed and still come up short. She looked at the electric bill and did the math before Harold could even finish his sentence. "Power bill alone is more than half your margin," she said. Harold nodded. "The worst part about being cornered is realizing which costs you can't control. Wheat prices, loan terms, weather. But then there are costs you can control, and the guilt of not controlling them burns like acid." Harold stared past her, not because he wasn't listening, but because something in his mind was reaching for a memory he'd ignored for years. Outside, beyond the barn, the old air motor windmill was turning slow and steady in the morning air. It had been there since before Harold could remember. It had pumped stock water for decades without sending a bill. His father had tried to say something about it before he died, and Harold had brushed it off as an old man clinging to old ways. Don't tear down what works, Harold. Don't tear it down just because something newer comes along. Harold had heard it, but he hadn't understood what it meant to be trapped by newer. Margaret followed his gaze. "The windmill," she said. Harold finally looked back at her. "That windmill's been pumping stock water for 26 years, and it hasn't cost us a cent in power," he said, more to himself than to her. Margaret tilted her head. "If we were pumping stock water with an electric motor for hours a day," she started. Harold didn't let her finish because he needed to hear it. "What would that cost?" Margaret did the numbers like she always did. "Motor that size is pulling 3 or 4 kilowatts when it's running. For hours a day, 30 days. $25, $30 a month," she said. Harold felt something shift in him, not hope yet, but direction. "We're not paying that," he said, "because we've got wind. And in Kansas that means just about always." Margaret didn't smile. She was too practical to smile at a single idea. "That gets us closer," she said. "Not out." Harold stood and pushed his chair back. His hands were shaking slightly, and he hated that they were. "There's more," he said. "Come with me." He led her out and past the chicken coop to the old stone spring house set into the hillside, half buried like it had always been part of the land. He opened the door, and the steady sound of water filled the space between them. The spring ran year-round. It didn't ask permission. It didn't care about wheat prices. Margaret put her hand into the water and pulled it back, cold. Harold said, "This spring puts out about 20 gallons a minute, all year." He watched her face because he needed her to understand what he was seeing. "My father built a water wheel here in 41, he said. Ran it to a car generator. Charged batteries. Powered the house during the war." Margaret looked at him sharply. "Powered the whole house?" Harold nodded. "He took it apart when we got grid power in 48. But the mounts are still there. The spring is still flowing." Margaret straightened, her mind already turning. "Could you rebuild it?" she asked. Harold felt the edge of reality in that question. "I think so," he said. "Pete Hansen over in Rosalia is a machinist at Boeing. He knows generators. He could help me wind a proper one. We'd need batteries and wire and some electrical components. But if we run the refrigerator and lights off this, we take that load off the grid completely." Margaret didn't romanticize it. She counted. "That's another 20, 25 a month," she said. "Between that and the windmill, we're near 55. Harold nodded. But he didn't stop there because he knew what she would say next, and she did. "Harold, that gets us to break even. It doesn't get us ahead, and it costs money to build. Money we don't have." Harold felt the truth of that like a punch. He looked at the springhouse door, then closed it as if closing it could hold in the worry. "I know," he said, "but there's one more thing." He took her to the old machine shed where equipment sat under canvas and dust. Things his father had kept, because his father didn't throw away a tool that still had work in it. Harold pulled back a tarp and revealed a 2-cylinder John Deere Model E stationary engine. It was heavy and ugly and honest. Margaret stared at it like it was a relic. Harold ran his hand along the metal. "My father ran this engine for 15 years, he said. Powered a corn sheller, a saw, whatever needed power. One engine, one source. And he had it set up with jack shafts and line shafts so he could run multiple machines. Right now I've got 4 separate electric motors out here, for separate draws, all adding to that bill." Margaret stepped closer. "How much to get it running?" she asked. Harold didn't pretend it was free. "Rings and gaskets might be $50 in parts. I can do the work myself." He paused and forced himself to say the next part because it mattered. "Gas is 20 cents a gallon now. This engine will run 8 hours on a gallon. I don't need it daily. Just when I'm processing grain or doing shop work. It replaces a whole stack of electric use." Margaret's eyes narrowed the way they did when she was testing whether she could believe. "So you're going to walk into John Matt's office Monday and tell him you're going to save the farm? With a windmill and a water wheel and an engine from before you were born," she said. Harold didn't flinch because she was right, and because sometimes the truth sounds ridiculous before it sounds smart. "I'm going to show him numbers," he said, "with about $300 in parts and materials. I cut the bill from 78 down to maybe 15 or 20. That's $60 a month in savings, $720 a year. That's the difference between making payments and losing the place." Margaret looked at him for a long moment, then looked back at the engine as if trying to imagine it running again. "300 we don't have," she said quietly. Harold's throat tightened. He'd been trying to avoid that part because it was the part that would make him feel like he was taking from the dead. He went back inside and opened the small box where he kept a few things that mattered. He didn't say anything at first. He just held up the ring, his mother's wedding ring. Gold, simple, worn smooth from decades of work. His father had handed it to him and said it was something to fall back on. Harold had never wanted to fall back on it. Margaret's face changed when she saw it, not into tears, but into something heavier. She reached out and touched it once, like you touch a bruise to confirm it's real. "It's worth 400, Harold said. "At least." He hated the sound of his own voice. "It's the only way I can buy what we need before Monday." Margaret didn't answer right away. Harold could see her doing her own arithmetic, not just money, but what it meant. If he sold the ring and failed, they'd lose the farm and lose the last thing his mother left him that had value. If he didn't sell it, they might lose the farm anyway, slowly, month by month, until the bank took it and there was nothing left but regret and what-ifs. Margaret put her hand over his and closed his fingers around the ring. "Then you better make it work," she said. Harold didn't feel brave. He felt committed. That was different. Friday, he tore down the John Deere engine and laid the parts out like a surgeon, remembering the skills his father taught him as a boy, and realizing he'd been lucky to have learned them. The cylinder bores were still smooth. The crank journals weren't chewed up. The engine wasn't dead. It had just been waiting. He made a list and drove into El Dorado Saturday morning with the ring in his pocket. He didn't tell himself stories about destiny. He told himself he had a plan and a clock. At Maya Goldstein's jewelry store, he placed the ring on the counter. She picked it up, looked at Harold's face, and didn't ask unnecessary questions. "420, she said. Harold swallowed. He nodded. She slid the cash across the counter like it weighed something. "Harold," she said, "softer when you get back on your feet. You come see me." He didn't promise because promises were what he was running out of. He bought the engine parts from the implement dealer. He bought batteries from the truck dealership. He bought copper wire and electrical components. By the time he drove back out of town, he had $80 left for groceries and whatever went wrong next. Because something always went wrong next. That afternoon, Margaret cooked dinner for Pete Hansen and his wife. Because if you're asking a man for help, you feed him. And because neighbors mattered more than pride. After dinner, Pete went with Harold to the spring house and studied the setup. Not as a dream, but as a machine. He did a quick calculation on the flow and the drop, then nodded once. "I can wind you a generator that'll handle it," Pete said. 12-volt system. 15 amps continuous output if we do it right. Harold felt relief and fear at the same time because 15 amps sounded like salvation, and also like a new promise he had to keep. "Bring me that car generator Monday after work," Pete said. "I'll have it done by Wednesday." Harold started to say he couldn't pay him, and Pete cut him off. "You helped me roof my barn last summer," Pete said. "This is what neighbors do." Sunday, Harold got the John Deere engine back together. He spent 3 hours getting the timing right, because if he rushed it, he'd pay for it later, and he didn't have later to spare. By evening, the engine was running smooth. It didn't roar like a tractor. It thumped steadily, like a heartbeat. Harold shut it down and stood there listening to the silence afterward, trying to imagine what a different electric bill would feel like in his hands. Monday was coming fast. 90 days was the bank's deadline. But Monday was the moment he had to walk into John Matt's office and convince a cautious man to give him the chance to prove anything at all. And Harold knew one thing for certain. If he walked in there with hope instead of numbers, he'd walk out with nothing. Monday morning, Harold walked into First National Bank in El Dorado with a folder under his arm. That weighed less than a pound and felt heavier than the engine block he had lifted the day before. John Matt was already at his desk, jacket off, sleeves rolled, glasses low on his nose, looking like a man who had read too many bad farm reports in the past year. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. "You said you had a plan," he said. Harold nodded and laid the papers out in a clean line. 12 months of electric bills, showing the steady climb, a breakdown of every motor and load on the farm, cost estimates for rebuilding the windmill maintenance, installing a spring house generator, restoring the John Deere engine, and consolidating power draws. He didn't sell a dream. He sold arithmetic. $78 last month, Harold said, tapping the bill. "If I cut that to 15 or 20, that's roughly $60 a month saved. $720 a year. That alone covers the gap between income and expenses." Matt flipped through the pages slowly. "You're proposing to run a modern farm on technology from before rural electrification," he said without looking up. "That's going backward." Harold kept his voice steady. "It worked for 30 years before grid power came in. It still works. Wind still blows. Water still runs. I'm not inventing anything. I'm just using what's already here." Matt finally looked up. "And if it breaks," Harold didn't hesitate, "then I fix it. Every part on that windmill can be rebuilt. The generator can be rewound. The engine can be rebuilt again. I control maintenance. I don't control wheat prices." Matt leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling for a moment like he was doing math in the air. "You're 3 months behind," he said. "Bank examiners want me to clean up anything past 60 days. Harold didn't interrupt. Matt tapped the folder once. "I'll give you 90 days. he said finally. You show me 3 months of power bills under $20. You show me your current on payments. Then we'll talk restructuring. But if this doesn't work, Harold, I can't protect you. 90 days. It sounded generous and impossible at the same time. Harold nodded once. That's all I need. He left the bank and didn't allow himself relief because nothing had been saved yet. He had permission to prove something. That was all. He drove straight home and climbed the windmill tower with a grease gun and toolbox. He hadn't been up there in 5 years. 30 feet off the ground, the Kansas wind felt stronger than it did from the yard. He forced himself not to look down and focused on what needed doing. Bearings cleaned, gears inspected, bolts tightened. He worked 3 hours without stopping because every minute mattered now in a way it hadn't before. When he climbed down, his legs were shaking, but the windmill turned smoother, cleaner, steady. It was one system done. Not new, just maintained. Wednesday Pete brought the rewound generator, and Harold didn't waste time thanking him twice. They mounted the water wheel shaft using steel salvaged from an old hay rake, and positioned the blades to catch maximum flow from the spring. Getting the angle right took patience. Too steep and it stalled. Too shallow and it wasted energy. By Friday evening the wheel was turning with authority, not fast but constant. The generator hummed. The voltage meter held at 12 volts. The needle showed a solid 15 amps feeding into the battery bank. Harold stood there watching that needle like it was a heartbeat. Batteries meant storage. Storage meant stability. He wired the refrigerator and house lights to the system carefully, double-checking every connection because a mistake here would cost him more than pride. When the refrigerator kicked on and stayed on without drawing from the grid, Harold didn't smile. He just nodded once. To systems working. Saturday he turned to the barn and the John Deere Model E. He rebuilt the old mounts for the line shaft, replaced worn belts, set pulley ratios so the engine could run multiple implements without strain. It wasn't glamorous work. It was alignment and tension and making sure nothing vibrated loose. When he finally engaged the belts and brought the engine up to speed, the line shaft spun and the machines along the wall came alive one by one under one source of power. For electric motors replaced by one gasoline engine that ran 8 hours on a gallon. He calculated the difference twice before trusting it. By Sunday evening he had 3 independent systems running. Wind for stock water, water for household power, engine for heavy work. Monday morning the first electric bill under the new setup arrived. Harold held it a second longer than necessary before opening it. $18.35, down from $78. Margaret exhaled before he did. It was proof. It wasn't victory. 90 days required consistency, but it was proof that the numbers weren't fantasy. Harold drove to the bank and handed Matt the bill without ceremony. Matt studied it. 1 month, he said. I need 3. Harold nodded. You'll get 3. August came in hot. For 6 straight days the temperature climbed above 105 degrees. The Springhouse generator had been designed for steady output, not punishment. By mid-month it started cutting out. The armature overheated. The charging current dropped. Harold could hear it in the change of pitch before he saw it on the meter. When the refrigerator switched back to grid power, he felt it like a personal insult. The August bill came in at $32. Better than $78, but not under $20. Harold didn't curse the heat. He tore the generator mount apart and rebuilt it with improved airflow, added cooling fins, opened the housing to increase circulation. 3 evenings and 1 full Saturday disappeared into that fix. He didn't complain. He recalculated. If the average stayed low enough, he still had a path. September arrived with a different problem. The wind stopped. Not slowed. Stopped. 12 days of still air. The windmill stood motionless over the stock tank. Cattle don't wait for weather to cooperate. Harold fired up the John Deere and belted it to the well pump. A gallon of gas ran 8 hours and pumped enough water for 2 days. It was still cheaper than electric pumping, but it wasn't free. And every extra gallon felt like time slipping away. The September bill arrived at $23, then another at $32 when usage spiked during repairs. Harold spread the bills out on the table at night and did the math over and over. The average was hovering at $21 and change. He had promised under $20. The difference was $1. $1 stood between kept your word and fell short. October brought wind again, steady and strong. The air motor spun day and night. The springhouse generator ran cool in the lower temperatures. The batteries stayed full. Harold used the engine only twice all month, burning less than 5 gallons of gas total. The system finally operated the way it had on paper. When the October bill arrived on November 2nd, 3 days before his meeting with Matt, Harold didn't open it right away. He set it on the table and looked at Margaret. "You open it," he said. She shook her head. "It's your work." He tore it open. $12.60. He did the average again. 18, 32, 23, 12.60, 21.45 across 90 days. $52 saved per month compared to before. $630 annually. Enough to make payments if prices held steady. Enough to catch up if discipline held. But not technically under 20 for all 3 months. Harold slept little before November 5th. Not because he doubted the systems now. They worked. He doubted whether a banker would accept an average when a promise had been precise. He walked into First National at 8 sharp with the bills, maintenance logs, weather notes documenting the calm spell, and a written projection showing expected stability going forward. Matt took his time reading. "You had problems in September," he said flatly. "Generator overheated in extreme heat," Harold said. "I redesigned cooling. It's stable now. We had an unusual calm period. I pumped with the engine. Still cheaper than electric." Matt calculated the average himself. $21.45, he said. "You said under 20. Harold met his eyes. "I said I could cut it from 78 to 15 or 20. I averaged 21 even with abnormal weather and equipment stress. That's a $52 monthly savings. $630 a year. Enough to service the loan and stay current. And the systems are now stabilized." Matt sat silent long enough for Harold to feel every missed payment in his bones. Then Matt opened a different folder. "The examiners want me to foreclose on anything past 60 days, he said. Harold didn't blink. "But these numbers show something else," Matt continued, tapping the bills. "They show management. They show you identified a problem, implemented a solution, corrected failures, and produced measurable results." He picked up a pen and began writing on the loan document. "I'm restructuring your debt, extending the term 3 years. Monthly payment drops from 68 to 45. You keep these power bills in this range, and you make those payments on time. We'll get through this." Harold didn't trust his voice at first. He finally managed. "You won't regret it." Matt gave him a look that wasn't quite a smile. "I better not." Harold walked out into November sunlight with the paper in his hand and something else. He hadn't felt in months: control. Not over the weather, not over wheat prices, but over his costs, over his systems, over his response when things broke. When he drove back home and told Margaret, she didn't cry. She just nodded once and said, "Good." That evening Harold checked the windmill one more time. It turned the same way it had for decades, not caring about bank letters or electric companies. Wind blew, water flowed. Machines ran if you maintained them. The farm hadn't been saved by hope or luck or a rise in prices. It had been saved by cutting a dependency that had quietly been draining it. And Harold understood then what his father had tried to tell him. Don't tear down what works just because something newer comes along. Some systems cost money every month. Others cost attention and work. He chose the ones he could control, and that made all the difference. By the time the second month began, Harold stopped thinking in terms of hope and started thinking in terms of margins, because hope doesn't average out on a ledger but numbers do. And he knew the banker in El Dorado would not be impressed by effort if the totals didn't hold. August had already tested the generator once, and though he had rebuilt the cooling system and widened the housing for airflow, he understood something he hadn't understood before. Systems behave differently under stress than they do on paper. Early September arrived without wind. Not a gentle slowdown, but a dead stillness that sat over Butler County like a lid. The windmill stood frozen above the stock tank, blades angled toward nothing. And for the first time since he had climbed that tower with a grease gun, he felt the full weight of depending on something he couldn't command. Cattle don't wait for averages to recover. Water levels began to drop. On the third day, Harold calculated remaining capacity and realized he had maybe 48 hours before he would have to act. He didn't curse the sky. He walked to the shed, rolled the John Deere Model E into position, belted it to the well pump, and brought it up to speed. The engine thumped steady, reliable, burning gasoline he had budgeted for grain processing, not daily pumping. 1 gallon ran 8 hours and filled enough water for 2 days. And he wrote the numbers down because writing them down made them manageable. 8 hours per gallon, 2 days per run, cost per gallon 20 cents. Compare that to electric draw per hour, calculate difference. It was still cheaper than flipping the grid switch, but it wasn't the clean victory he had imagined in July. Margaret watched him log each gallon in a small notebook at the kitchen table at night. "Is it enough?" she asked once, not meaning water but the margin. Harold ran the projection again. "If the wind comes back before the 12th day, we stay near 20, he said. "If it doesn't, we edge higher." He did not say how much higher, because she already knew the promise to Matt had been under 20. By day 8, the wind had not returned. The generator in the spring house ran fine in the cooler air, batteries charged steadily. Refrigerator and lights held without touching the grid. But water was non-negotiable, and water cost fuel now. Harold began to feel the psychological shift that comes when a plan moves from proactive to reactive. In July, he had been cutting dependency. In September, he was compensating for nature. He refused to let that become panic. Instead, he recalculated load distribution, shortened engine runs by staggering pumping times, timed watering cycles more precisely so he wasn't oversupplying. Small adjustments, but small adjustments add up. On the 12th day, a faint breeze moved the grass, but not enough to turn the mill. That night, Harold lay awake not because he doubted the systems anymore, but because he knew perception mattered. If Matt saw volatility, he might read it as instability. Harold needed to frame the volatility as resilience. He began drafting notes for the November meeting weeks in advance, documenting weather patterns, logging temperatures, recording maintenance changes. He wasn't just saving a farm. He was building a case. On the 13th morning, the wind returned, not dramatic, just steady enough to move the blades and lift the rod. Harold stood outside longer than necessary watching the first rotations, because that slow turning represented margin returning to his side. He shut down the engine and recalculated fuel burn during the calm spell. More than planned, but still below electric equivalent. The September bill arrived and he opened it without ceremony. $23. Not 30 to like the heatwave month, not 18 like the first win. But above the line he had drawn in front of a banker. He didn't flinch. He averaged the numbers again. First month 18.35. Second month 32 during generator overheating, now 23. The rolling average hovered just over 21. $1 above promise. $1 that could decide perception. Margaret watched him stare at the figures. "You still cut it in half," she said. Harold nodded. "Half isn't the deal. Under 20 was the deal." He didn't blame her or himself. He blamed precision. Precision had power, but it also had edges. October had to be clean. He went over every system again, not because they were broken, but because he could not afford surprise. He tightened bolts on the windmill tower, rebalanced the water wheel, inspected belts on the line shaft, checked battery terminals for corrosion, recalibrated the voltage meter to confirm accuracy. Each action reduced uncertainty by a fraction, and fractions matter when margins are thin. The wind in October came strong and consistent. The air motor spun day and night without complaint. The springhouse generator hummed cool and steady. The engine sat mostly idle except for 2 grain processing sessions. That burned less than 5 gallons combined. Harold tracked kilowatt equivalents, estimated avoided grid draw, calculated cumulative savings to date. By mid-October, the projected average dipped under 20 if the trend held. That was the first time since September's calm that he felt genuine forward pressure, instead of defensive calculation. Still, he did not celebrate. He treated every day as conditional until the envelope arrived. On November 2nd, the power bill sat on the kitchen table when he came in from the barn. He washed his hands first, not out of superstition but habit, then opened it. $12.60, lower than even his conservative estimate. He immediately recalculated the 90-day average, approximately 2145, if including the spike month. But if isolating stabilized performance, after modifications, the trajectory was clearly under 20. He debated which framing was honest and decided both were. The systems had been stress-tested. Failures had been corrected. Current performance indicated sustained reduction. The numbers told a story of adaptation, not accident. Yet the average still exceeded the literal promise by a narrow margin. That narrowness occupied his mind more than the victory of 1260. He prepared documentation that night, maintenance logs detailing the redesigned cooling for the generator after the heat wave, fuel logs for the engine during windless days, weather notes citing 12 consecutive calm days in September, comparative analysis showing electric cost equivalent had he not used gasoline pumping. He organized the papers so that the narrative was clear: problem identified, solution implemented, stress encountered, solution improved, stable outcome achieved. He understood something fundamental now about survival. It wasn't about avoiding stress. It was about proving you could respond to stress. As November 5th approached, Harold did not fear the systems. He feared interpretation. Would John Matt see volatility as weakness or resilience? Would the bank examiner see 2145 as failure, or $630 in annual savings as management? Harold rehearsed his explanation in plain terms because exaggeration would damage credibility. I promised to cut 78 to 15 or 20, he would say. I cut it to roughly 21 during abnormal conditions and to 12 once stabilized. He practiced saying it without defensiveness. Margaret listened once and nodded. Say it exactly like that, she said. No apology. The night before the meeting, Harold did not revisit the windmill or the spring house. He had already done the work. Instead, he sat at the table and looked at the notebook filled with fuel entries and voltage readings, and small adjustments that no one but him would ever appreciate. Those entries represented control regained piece by piece. He realized then that the true shift over the past 3 months wasn't only in the electric bill. It was in his posture. In July, he had been reacting to numbers. In November, he was generating them. That difference, he hoped, would matter as much as $1. On the morning of November 5th, Harold woke before the alarm. Not because he had work to start, but because there was no work left to do on the systems themselves. And that was the unsettling part. For 3 months, every anxiety had been answered with action. A bolt tightened, a belt replaced, a calculation redone. But now the outcome depended on a man behind a desk reading numbers. That could be interpreted to different ways. He dressed without hurry, gathered the folder he had reorganized twice the night before, and drove into El Dorado with the engine noise in his truck sounding louder than usual. Because silence would have been easier. At First National Bank, the lobby looked the same as it had in July. Polished floor, quiet counters. Nothing about it suggesting that a family's land could change hands with a signature. John Matt was already at his desk again, glasses low, expression neutral. The same posture he used when reading loan files that ended badly. You've got your 3 months, he said without preamble. Harold placed the bills on the desk in order: August, September, October, then slid the maintenance logs and projections beside them. He didn't start speaking immediately. He let Matt look first because interruption could feel like persuasion, and he didn't want persuasion. He wanted evaluation. Matt studied the first bill. 1835, he said quietly. He flipped to the next. 32, his brow tightened slightly. Generator overheated, Harold said evenly. Redesigned cooling. Stable since mid-August. Matt turned to the third. 23, 12 days no wind, Harold replied. Pumped with engine. Logged fuel. Still lower than electric equivalent. Matt turned to the final bill. 1260. He sat back and removed his glasses. Average is roughly 2145, he said. He didn't sound accusatory. He sounded precise. Harold nodded. Yes, sir. The room felt smaller than it had in July. Matt tapped the stack of papers once with his finger. You told me under 20. Harold met his eyes. I told you I could cut 78 to 15 or 20. I cut it to roughly 21 during abnormal weather and equipment stress. After modifications and stable conditions, it's running in the 12 to 15 range. That's $52 a month saved even counting the worst weeks. $630 a year. Enough to make payments and catch up. Matt didn't respond immediately. Instead, he opened Harold's loan file and read the delinquency notes, the missed payments, the examiner comments in red ink that Harold had never seen but could imagine clearly. The examiners are pushing hard, Matt said finally. They want clean books. They don't like volatility. Harold didn't argue with that. Volatility was weather and heat, he said. Response was redesign and backup. The systems now have redundancy. If wind stops, I have engine. If heat rises, generator cooling holds. I can't control the sky. I can control maintenance. Matt looked at the maintenance log more closely then, flipping through pages filled with fuel entries, voltage readings, dates, small notations about belt tension adjustments and bearing lubrication. You kept records, he said. Yes, sir. Why? Matt asked, not unkindly. Harold considered the question. Because if it failed, I needed to know why. And if it worked, I needed to prove it. Matt leaned back again, this time slower. Most men who come in here 3 months behind don't bring documentation, he said. They bring explanations. Harold felt the distinction settle in the room. I'm not asking for patience, he said. I'm showing you sustainability. The word sounded formal in his own ears, but it was accurate. Matt turned back to the bills and ran the calculation himself with a small adding machine, the keys clicking softly. When he finished, he didn't speak right away. He looked at Harold the way a banker looks at risk, measuring not just numbers but pattern. Your income is still tight, Matt said. Wheat prices haven't improved. No, sir. So this margin matters. Yes, sir. Matt closed the folder halfway and rested his hand on it. If I foreclose, he said calmly, the bank sells the land in a weak market. We recover part of the loan, maybe. If I restructure and you maintain this reduction, you stay solvent. He paused. But I need to justify that decision. Harold didn't plead. He simply slid the projection sheet forward. It outlined anticipated monthly savings under average wind conditions, fuel contingencies for calm periods, and a conservative estimate for annual generator maintenance costs. Even if we average 22 instead of 15, Harold said, we still net more than $600 a year compared to before. That difference keeps me current. Matt read it slowly. You built redundancy, he said at last. Wind, water, engine. 3 systems. Yes, sir. And you've already seen them under stress. Yes, sir. Silence settled between them again. But it was different from July's silence. In July, the silence had been doubt. Now it was calculation. Matt picked up his pen. Here's what I can do, he said. I'll restructure the loan. Extend the term 3 years. Monthly payment drops from 68 to 45. That gives you breathing room while prices are low. Harold felt his breath leave before he realized he'd been holding it. Matt continued, but this isn't charity. You keep those power bills in this range. You keep logging maintenance, and you make every payment on time. First late payment, and we revisit this. Yes, sir, Harold said, the words steady now. Matt signed the restructuring documents and slid them across the desk. The examiners want to see management, he said. This is management. Harold signed where indicated. The ink dried quickly. The farm that had felt like it was slipping through his fingers in July now felt anchored not by luck but by numbers. When he stood to leave, Matt looked up one more time. You know, he said, most people add debt to solve a problem. You cut dependency. Harold didn't answer with philosophy. It was the only lever I had, he said. Outside the bank the air was crisp, and for the first time in months the weight in his chest had shifted from pressure to responsibility. The restructuring wasn't a rescue. It was an agreement. He drove home and found Margaret near the garden, hands dirty, posture straight. She looked at his face before he spoke. 45 a month, he said. 3-year extension. She closed her eyes briefly. Not in disbelief, but in acknowledgement of effort paying off. Then we work, she said simply. That evening Harold checked the systems not because he feared them, but because routine had become discipline. The windmill turned steady. The springhouse generator hummed. The engine sat ready, belts aligned, fuel measured. None of it was dramatic. None of it looked like salvation. But together they had shifted the farm from reaction to design. Harold understood something now that he hadn't in July. Dependency hides in convenience. The grid had been easy, and easy had nearly cost him the land. The old systems demanded attention, but attention gave control. As the sun lowered, he stood near the windmill tower and listened to the steady rhythm of the pump rod moving up and down. It wasn't nostalgia. It wasn't rebellion against progress. It was arithmetic backed by effort. 3 months earlier he had walked into a bank asking for time. Now he had walked out with terms he could meet. The difference between those two walks was not hope or luck. It was a series of small, deliberate decisions repeated under pressure. And Harold knew that as long as wind blew, water flowed. And he kept writing numbers in that notebook. The farm would not be at the mercy of a single bill again. In the weeks after the restructuring, Harold noticed something that had nothing to do with kilowatts or gallons of fuel and everything to do with posture. He walked the fields differently, not because the crops had changed or because wheat prices had improved, but because the pressure had shifted from impending loss to earned responsibility, and that distinction mattered more than he would have admitted in July. The agreement with the bank did not erase the missed payments or the thin margins. It simply converted panic into structure, and structure was something Harold knew how to manage. He began November by making the first $45 payment under the new terms, before it was technically due, not as a gesture to impress John Matt, but as a statement to himself. That discipline had replaced scrambling. Every dollar he no longer sent to Kansas Power and Light stayed inside the farm's system, circulating instead of leaking. And he could see that circulation in small ways. Feed paid in cash instead of credit. A delayed repair now handled immediately. A little breathing space in the grocery envelope that Margaret kept folded in a kitchen drawer. None of it looked dramatic from the road. The barn still leaned slightly on its west side. The fence post still needed replacing in the north pasture, and the tractor still coughed on cold mornings. But internally, the farm was operating under a different logic. Harold had built redundancy where there had been single-point failure, and that change extended beyond machinery into mindset. He found himself thinking ahead in months instead of reacting week by week. When a bearing on the windmill began to hum differently in late November, he didn't wait for it to grind down. He climbed the tower that afternoon and replaced it, logging the time and cost. When the water wheel shaft vibrated under heavier winter flow, he rebalanced it. Before it threatened alignment, the notebook thickened with entries, not because things were constantly breaking, but because he no longer ignored the early signals of strain. Margaret noticed the shift too. In July, their conversations had revolved around fear. What if prices drop further? What if the bank refuses? What if the systems fail? By December, the conversations were about projection. If wind averages this range, if fuel stays at 20 cents, if payments remain steady, where will they stand by spring? Fear had narrowed their thinking. Control expanded it. One evening, Harold spread the past for electric bills across the table again, not to check them for errors, but to show Margaret the pattern. Look at this slope, he said quietly. From 78 down to 12. Even counting the spikes, it trends down. Margaret studied the numbers the way she had on the first morning. It's not the 12 that matters, she said. It's that you know why it's 12. Harold nodded. That was the real difference. In July, he had known the total, but not the levers. Now every component of that bill had a cause attached to it. The refrigerator load was tied to generator output. The pump load was tied to wind availability and engine backup. The barn equipment was tied to fuel logs and scheduled usage. There were no mysteries left in the electric line, and removing mystery removed fear. Word traveled quietly through Butler County that Harold had cut his power bill in half, using old contraptions, and a few neighbors stopped by out of curiosity. He didn't preach or present himself as clever. He showed them the numbers and the notebook and let the system speak. Some nodded politely and left unconvinced, comfortable with the grid and unwilling to climb towers or resemblance shafts. Others lingered longer, asking practical questions about load calculations and fuel efficiency. Harold answered them honestly, including the setbacks, including the month that ran $32 and the 12 days without wind. He didn't sell perfection. He sold resilience. By midwinter he realized something else. The systems demanded attention, but not constant worry. Once tuned, they ran with a steadiness that felt almost quiet compared to the unpredictable swings of market, prices, and bank letters. That quiet steadiness restored something in him he hadn't recognized as lost the sense that work done directly on the farm produced direct results. When wheat prices dipped again in January, he felt the pressure, but not the paralysis. He adjusted grain sales timing, trimmed non-essential spending, and leaned more heavily on the cost savings he had engineered. The farm's vulnerability had been reduced by a single strategic shift, cutting a fixed external cost that had no ceiling. He understood now that dependency compounds silently. Each month he had written a check to the power company without question, assuming modern convenience justified modern cost. It had taken a foreclosure threat to force him to interrogate that assumption. Late one afternoon in February, as wind pushed steady across the fields and the mill blades turned without drama, Harold climbed the tower again, not because it required repair, but because he wanted to look out over the land from the vantage point he had nearly lost. From up there the farm looked smaller than it felt from the ground. Fields squared off in winter light, the barn roof patched in places, the house modest and unremarkable. There was nothing heroic about it, and that was precisely why it mattered. It represented years of payments, seasons of labor, decisions made correctly and incorrectly but always owned. He thought about the morning in July when 3 pieces of paper had seemed larger than the land itself. The difference between that morning and this one was not luck or charity from a banker. It was the willingness to confront a number and trace it back to its source, instead of absorbing it as fate. When he climbed down, he did not feel triumphant. He felt aligned. Back inside the house, Margaret had coffee waiting, and she asked the question that had hovered quietly for months. "If prices recover," she said, "will you go back to the grid for everything?" Harold shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "Grid is backup now, not default." That single sentence captured the reversal more clearly than any spreadsheet. Backup instead of default. Control instead of dependence. The farm would still face droughts, market swings, mechanical failures, and unexpected expenses. Nothing about wind or water made it immune to reality. But the core had shifted. Instead of being at the mercy of one rising bill, Harold had diversified risk into systems he understood and could repair with his own hands. Years later, when someone might ask John Matt why he had restructured a loan for a farmer 3 months behind, the banker would have a folder filled with bills trending downward and logs proving management. But Harold would remember something different. He would remember the moment he stopped asking whether he could survive and started calculating how. He would remember selling his mother's ring not as sacrifice but as leverage. He would remember the dollar that separated promise from average, and the discipline required to defend that dollar without excuses. Most of all, he would remember that the farm was not saved by nostalgia for old machines or rejection of modern power. It was saved by identifying the one expense that quietly controlled everything else, and cutting it at the root. Wind still blew across Kansas the way it had for decades. Water still flowed through the springhouse with indifferent consistency. Engines still ran if maintained. Those facts had not changed. What changed was Harold's willingness to rely on them deliberately, instead of treating them as relics. And as long as he kept that discipline tracking, adjusting, maintaining, the farm would stand, not because nothing went wrong, but because when something did, he would have options. In the end, the story was not about a windmill or a water wheel or even a bank. It was about the moment a man decided that dependency was a choice he could reduce. Once he reduced it, the rest followed in measurable increments: 78 to 18, 32 corrected to 23, 12, 60 sustained. Numbers, not speeches. Systems, not wishes. And that was enough to keep the land in his name.